It was not part of their blood. It came to them very late, with long arrears to make good, when the Saxon began to hate. They were not easily moved. They were icy, willing to wait, till every count should be proved, ere the Saxon began to hate. Their voices were even and low, their eyes were level and straight. There was neither sign nor show when the Saxon began to hate. It was not preached to the crowd, it was not taught by the state. No man spoke it aloud when the Saxon began to hate. It was not suddenly bred, it will not swiftly abate, through the chilled years ahead, when time shall count from the date that the Saxon began to hate.
Wow, that is a fantastic intro. And we are live, right?
Yeah, we are. Yeah, we are. We are live.
That's a fantastic poem, and I mean, it really is essentially summoning the martial spirit, isn't it? We are back with another live stream. I'm Rick Rockwell, and of course with Mark Brahman. And our subject today is the god Mars. And most of you will know that, well, the timing is good because most of you will know that March is the month of Mars. And hence that is our subject today. Good afternoon, Mark.
Good afternoon, Rick. A pleasure as always. Yeah, so the topic is Mars. Mars, the god of war. And, I don't know where you want to start with this, but, I'm happy to jump in anywhere. So maybe you want to frame a good starting point, though, for our audience.
Yeah, I'll let things. I'll kick things off, and then we'll take it from there. And I mean, you always have a lot of depth and a lot of things to kind of elucidate on, and that's what we'll do. Now, Mars. I mean, most people will be familiar with Mars, of course. God of war, has a planet named after him. One thing, a lot of times, though, I think people conflate Mars with Ares. And I mean, Ares was identified by the Romans as Mars, but the two have different characteristics, very different characteristics in a lot of ways. Ares was portrayed much more so as a more violent, kind of chaotic sort of god, and often treated with contempt and derision. Whereas Mars is much more salubrious, you would say, much more controlled, disciplined, and I think that is a big difference. If any god embodies the difference between the Greeks and the Romans, I think Mars is probably perfect in that respect. Just in his character, his essence, and the way the city itself sort of embraced him. One thing a lot of people may not know is that Mars, of course, is the father of Romulus. And therefore, I believe he was, he was the father of Romulus through the rape of, who is it? Do you know?
It's Rhea Silvius.
Yeah.
Sylvia, I think.
That's it. So, I mean, what that In my mind, what that essentially tells us is that there is an understanding right from the get-go that Rome is a martial city, that the the characteristics, the archetype, the aspirations of Mars are what the city is built on, and we see that we've seen that through their rise, how they came to greatness, and I think when they lost that, they lost their martial aspect when they were no longer able to produce or encourage their own Roman citizens to fight for Rome and to join the army and to essentially defend Rome. They had to rely heavily on mercenaries. And once that martial spirit had left the city, then that was essentially the end of Rome. So I think that's a very interesting. I think that's a very interesting parallel, and it also just really speaks to just how essential Mars was to Rome. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh yeah, no, everything you said I agree with. I mean, one thing I'll say, which is kind of echoing what you've already said, is that yeah, Mars was important to Rome in ways that he was not important to Greece. He was one of the primary gods of Rome, and this is dissimilar from Greece. And he was held a kind of venerated position, and was venerated in a way that he was not in Greece. But he was probably, we could say that he was the second most powerful or venerated of the gods in Greece, second only to Jupiter. Um, so Jupiter and Mars is a son of Jupiter, a son of Jupiter by Juno. So he is the only Olympian god that descends both of Juno and Jupiter. Now, of the 12 Olympians. Now, there is Venus, who has kind of important similarities, I would argue, to Mars in the sense that she represents a kind of every woman and an Aryan every woman. But she is descended solely from uh, Caelus or Uranus, right? And her birth occurs when she's severed from Caelus or Uranus through this castration of Caelus, which is, a kind of subversive thing. And actually, the myth, Plato actually criticized the myth as being subversive. Now, his interest in criticizing the myth might have been because he was a sort of secret admirer of Kronos or Saturn, which I think is probably was the case actually. But that castration motif was understood as subversive by guys like Plato. Now, of course, Plato himself was understood as subversive, right? So the myth itself we could understand as something that the Greeks looked at as a way of understanding their history, um, through parable and myth. Um, and Plato had a sort of objection to that depiction, right? Because he thought it cast Kronos or Saturn in a bad light as being a castrator of Caelus, or Uranus in the Greek context. But in any case, so those two gods are distinct in that way. Now, the other god, in other words, we can say that their heritage as Aryan Olympians is pretty. They could be understood as sort of pure in this regard. Apollo would be another example of that too. Now, Apollo's mother is distinct from Juno. Uh, his mother is Leto in the Greek. She's a Hyperborean, as is in Apollo is known as the Hyperborean. So he also has a kind of pure lineage, you might say, among the Olympians. But Mars, as his brother, is shares that distinction of having a kind of pure lineage, descended both from the sky father Jupiter and the sky mother Juno. So he has that aspect to him of being a kind of Aryan figure. And in fact, I would argue that in his Greek name Ares, I would argue is cognate of the root word for Aryan. So in the Persian, in the old Persian, it would be area, or something like this, right?
Hmm.
I would say I would argue that they're cognate. Now, the word itself, people trace the meaning of the word, which I think is also, and I think that it can have area we understand to mean noble or of good family, right? So it's a kind of genetic distinction.
Right.
Um, but the normal sort of, or the kind of conventional or traditional etymology of the name Aries is the meaning is war, right?
Hmm.
Which I think is, I think, and I think that both can be true simultaneously, right? So in other words, it can, the word Aries can have both meanings. Now, as to what the original meaning was, I mean that's a kind of answer that's lost to time, of course. But I think that we can understand Aries as having both meanings, representing war and also nobility and Aryan nobility. So
Right.
I think the name itself is kind of it's a cool little artifact of myth and of history, in the sense that it probably more than any other name or character, Mars or Aries identifies the Aryan as a martial type, right? As a warrior.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that that's a kind of, I think that that is part of our character. Um, Now, I think a kind of overemphasis of that part of our character can be negative, can be a bad thing. In other kind of more affirmative or positive aspects of our character are seen more clearly in figures like Apollo. But of course, they ultimately they're brothers and they have a similarity and represent a similar lineage, as it were.
Yeah.
Um, Anyways, I think you were about to talk, so
Well,
let me grab the mic, please.
okay. Well, on that subject, I had a thought about this. I mean, I was reading up on Mars earlier this week, and I was thinking about the position of both Mars and Apollo, or Aries and Apollo, and I had a thought on it. And I mean, you let me know if you think this is way off base, or maybe it's not. I sort of, the fact that you brought up an interesting point, that Mars is the progeny of both Jupiter and Juno. And to me, that sort of indicates that he is of that land, of that civilization, um, a homegrown representative, sort of, like brought up from the civilization. Whereas Apollo strikes me as, because Leto was his mother, he's he strikes me as a rejuvenation, because he's coming from Hyperborea, and the Greeks and the Romans were both Aryan people, and they had originally come from up north. And it was my thought that they sort of recognized that Apollo, that's where their origins were the strongest there, and they had sort of, that led to a rejuvenation of their people in a sense. Now, do you think that's off?
No, I mean, I think that's an interesting reading. Not something that I would necessarily had really even considered, to be honest with you. But one thing that they say about Apollo is that he's the Hyperborean, right? So the idea in the myth with Apollo is that he's present during the spring and summer, especially, right? And
Right.
during the winter, he summers or rather, he winters in Hyperborea, up in the north in Hyperborea. Now, Hyperborea means above the north wind, right? So we can understand it also as a kind of place of snow and ice. But then there was also a kind of mythical conception of Hyperborea, which also held for Olympus, whereas above the kind of snow and ice, there was a kind of land of eternal spring and perfect weather, almost like a kind of San Diego, if you will, right?
Yeah.
And a kind of ideal utopian world. And so in this myth, there was also this myth for Olympus too. And I think it's important to point out that both Olympus and Hyperborea were understood as lands of snow, like places of snow. The he in Hyperborea. I mean, I don't want to go too far on the Apollo mythos, so I'll be brief with this description. But in Hyperborea, Apollo enjoyed the priests, the Boreads, I think is the pronunciation, who were these gigantic priests, who share kind of curious similarities to Samson in the biblical myth. I will mention, and this is something that I'll explore in the upcoming book. But they also have kind of magical hair that empowers them, right? And in fact, their hair allows them flight, and they also have angel wings. And so there's sort of these angelic figures that are the priests, and they're also giants. So in some ways, they're similar to the frost giants that we'll encounter later in Norse mythology. But they represent the Hyperboreans, and their mother is Snow. Kion. I don't. The pronunciation. I will not get correct, but I think it's Khione. Um, but it's the Greek word for snow, essentially, and and she is the mother, if I'm remembering correctly, of the Boreads, who are these represent a kind of gigantic race of Hyperboreans who worship Apollo, and Apollo is also understood as a Hyperborean. Now, so what you're saying, I think, is it does resonate with me because theoretically you could argue whether this was intended or not, or it appears to us now as a kind of sort of Jungian phenomena where we sort of kind of realize after the fact that this is a kind of meaning of the myth, that he represents a kind of a racial replenishment, as it were, a kind of the northern invader coming back in to sort of rejuvenate the blood. I mean, that is a possible interpretation of Apollo. Again, whether this was intended or this is a kind of Jungian realization after the fact is something that we can contemplate. But yeah, I think you could say that. So, but in there as well, there's a kind of seasonal aspect to it, right? So Apollo is returning to replenish the blood, if we understand that, if we accept that sort of meaning, and he's retreating in the winter back into Hyperborea, and he's returning in the spring, and then the spring also we can find in the spring as well. And I think that this does have a kind of intended meaning as opposed to a kind of Jungian meaning. In the metaphor of the spring, we can also understand a metaphor for the spring of civilization, or for the development of city states and the founding of cities and this sort of thing. The metaphor of spring applies there. And Apollo, we understand, is a kind of god, a colonial god, a god of colonists, who establishes city states and this sort of thing. So I like your reading, but again, I would have to look at it in a kind of closer way to figure out if that was a kind of intended meaning of that myth, or if it's a kind of Jungian realization after the fact. If you understand the distinction I'm trying to make.
Yeah. And what it's fair to say, though, that at least especially in comparison between the two, that Mars is much more of an everyman. No.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I think that is in, not only that, I think that there are I think that there are kind of intended similarities between the figure of Mars and the Hebrew figure of Adam in the Hebrew Bible. So, in other words, I think that these two figures are synonymous on some level, and in fact, there could have been a kind of conscious referencing of Mars or Ares in the Hebrew Bible by the Jewish scribes. Um, one thing that we can point to now, this can have many meanings and many interpretations, and I think multiple interpretations and meanings are valid. So, in other words, it can have many meanings simultaneously that were intended by the authors. And I think you find that sort of layering in Jewish esoteric moralization with some frequency, and that points to kind of the sophistication of it and the cleverness of it. But in the Hebrew Bible, Adam, for example, his name means to be red, right? And he's a farmer figure. Mars, especially in Rome, is, Mars is not just a martial figure, and I think this is kind of an important thing to point out. Is, to your point, he's a kind of everyman, but he also represents a kind of laborer. He represents a farmer. He's an agricultural figure, but he's an agricultural figure in a way that's dissimilar from dying and rising gods like Bacchus, or harvest gods like Saturn, where there's something different going on with the symbols and the message, in the parables and symbols that those gods are involved with. Mars, in contrast, represents a kind of farmer, right? He represents a farmer soldier. So he shares this in common with the figure of Adam. Now, he's also associated with the color of red. The planet Mars is red. So the name Adam means to be red. And Edom, Edom and Adam are the same word. It's just a different pronunciation of the same Hebrew word. But Edom will become identified with Rome in rabbinical writings, right? So the idea there is that Edom, which is descended of Esau, and Esau is very famously a kind of Aryan or Gentile, non-Jewish figure, contrasted with Jacob, who is a kind of proto-Jewish figure. Esau, Edom, Adam are all associated with Rome. And Mars, of course, is one of the defining gods of Rome. He's also associated with the color red. Red becomes a color associated with Mars. And in the case of Mars, it's typically thought, well, the red relates to the fact that he's a god of war. So it relates to bloodshed, right? Now, I think that there is more going on there. The symbol of the color of red is a kind of complex one. But that, I think that is one sort of valid understanding or reading of the color, at least as it concerns the figure of Mars. Anyways, you were about to speak.
No, I'm fascinated by the that connection with Adam there. I'd never thought or considered or even heard about that before.
Well, and just to kind of further corroborate that connection is that Adam, the word for Adam in the Hebrew, it doesn't just mean man, it also means kind of common type or common man, right? And we also get that sense as well from the figure of Mars, particularly in the context of Rome. But what I can talk about now though is how he was different in Greece, the figure. And when I say that, you say that they are different gods. In a sense, they are different gods. I mean, ultimately, they are the same god in the sense that they represent the same archetype. But in Greece, in the mythology of Greece, and most of the myths that we get, in the Greco-Roman world come from Greece, of course. Greece is a kind of creative period of myth development. And Rome is taking a lot of these myths and sort of adapting them to their own ends in a kind of intelligent way. I mean, Rome, there's a lot of advantages to Rome over Greece. Now, Greece also has some advantages. It's a creative period, and it's kind of represents the cradle of Europe in many ways, and it's sort of the beginning. I mean, you could argue that Crete ultimately represents the cradle, but Greece, to the extent that we understand, we're talking about the civilization after the Minoan civilization. Ultimately the Hellenic civilization. When that can be seen as like the first sort of truly European civilization, I would argue. Crete is a little odd. It's a little different, and the Greeks had a view of it that it was different, and it has very much of a kind of pre-Hellenic vibe to it. And when we think of the pre-Hellenic period, we think especially of the dominance of gods like Kronos or Saturn, who are ultimately sort of proto-Jewish gods. Crete is also where Saturn was, according to Tacitus, Saturn was expelled from Crete. Tacitus relays the information, which I think is compelling. It may not actually be the actual etymology, but it is useful information, and I think it is an important clue in deciphering a lot of this myth. But he argues that the term Judah, or ultimately the term Jew, comes from Mount Ida in Crete, and he describes how the Jews were expelled from Crete, and they were, but the way that he describes it is in more mythological terms, in the sense that Kronos or Saturn was expelled, and the Jews who worshipped him at Mount Ida fled with him, right? And Jupiter was the one who expelled uh, Saturn. Now, this might be related to, the Athenian world, or the Hellenic world coming to dominate uh, the old Minoan civilization. It might be related to that, for example. But it does point to an interesting, and I think that I established this in my writing as well, is that Crete becomes a kind of important proto-Jewish inhabitation in the ancient world. Um, but I think we're a little off the topic of Mars, so I'm going to return to that. But uh, Ares in the ancient world in Greece has a kind of, he's more of a kind of villain, you could say, in the Greek myths. And interestingly, in our myths today, he is also a villain, right? So
Yeah,
in
it's funny you mentioned that, because
Yeah.
that's something I wanted to bring up when you look at these patterns, right? And the same way, I'll use the term Hollywood so the channel can stay on YouTube. The same way Hollywood portrays, you know, cops, soldiers, especially, like heartland types, as, idiots, or ignorant, or hypocrites, and ultimately figures of ridicule. This is the exact same pattern you would see in the way myths were implanted or used to subvert, a martial character like Ares, who essentially was from that Aryan population and did represent, the fighting force, essentially. And it's the exact same pattern, 2,000-3,000 years later, of ridicule, and buffoonery and stuff like that, right?
Yeah, no, I think that that's correct. So, and I think so what you're seeing and I think that you could reasonably make the argument that this sort of negative or cynical perspective of Ares that appears in the Greek myth ultimately has a kind of proto-Jewish origin. That's the argument I would make, and so because Ares in my mind is clearly an Aryan figure, but uh, I don't. I think that it's not. It's not. He wasn't depicted in a wholly negative way in Greece, but but there is that kind of bias that emerges, and there are other figures that are more sympathetic, certainly, than Ares. One of the primary myths around Ares, which is kind of interesting and and a little amusing actually, is that he basically was screwing Hephaestus's wife. Now, Hephaestus is a kind of clear proto-Jewish figure that emerges from a pre-Hellenic world, and he's a fire god. He's the smith, and we think of him now in a kind of sympathetic light, and the Greeks also thought of him in this sympathetic light. But he definitely is one of these gods that we could class as proto-Jewish, and he has a kind of sexual rivalry with Mars or Ares in Greece. And one of the most famous stories around Ares is that he is, basically Aphrodite is cheating on Vulcan or Hephaestus with Mars or Ares, and that they're captured, right? So they're caught in the act of cheating or in the act of adultery, and Hephaestus throws a magical net on the pair, and it's Hephaestus is understood as a kind of genius of engineering and invention, and the net itself is an invisible net because the net itself is so fine that they're captured in this net and they can't escape from the net, and they're dragged before Jupiter, and for Jupiter to render judgment. And Vulcan's hope is that Jupiter will punish Mars for screwing his wife, as it were. And but Jupiter just laughs. He laughs, right? So it's a kind of interesting myth where and then later the Romans will pair in a kind of conscious way. Will pair Venus and Mars, and you could argue as a kind of in a kind of eugenic way. They'll pair them in their propaganda and religion and art as a kind of couple, right?
Hmm.
And they are, the symbolism here is might be a little imperfect, but you can see that the effort there is good. But their child is Cupid, right? So maybe the thought there, the Romans were thinking that love itself is a kind of child of Mars and Venus, though Cupid is a kind of more is a darker figure in a lot of ways in ancient Greece. Eros was his name in ancient Greece. In any case, yeah, I mean, I think that there is that difference of presentation, whereas Mars is a more heroic and venerated figure in Rome, and particularly in the practice of their religion. You know what I mean? So he was the god of their soldiers. And it makes sense that they would venerate Mars because they were a very martial people. And a lot of the success of the Romans was through military conquest and through warfare. And they developed in a very sophisticated military way. Now, of course, the Greeks also developed in a very sophisticated military way as well, but the Romans surpassed them ultimately, and ultimately the reason that they would be, a civilization that would dominate Greece was because they were more militarily sophisticated.
Well, and even amongst the Greeks themselves, I mean, they were surpassed by sort of their own kinsmen again from the north, right? With Philip and Alexander and the
Oh, the
Macedonians.
Macedonians, sure, sure, yeah, no, that is a very interesting history. The Spartans are a very interesting people. They would be beaten by the Thebans. The Thebans are a very interesting people, but ultimately the Macedonians would become the dominant tribe in Greece or in the Greek Empire, as it were.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, but I don't
Now,
know.
with
Oh,
with
please.
with Rome, um, so I mean, as you mentioned, and rightfully so, Mars was the primary god that soldiers would worship. But there was another cult that was sort of introduced later. Was it Mithras or Minerva? There was another
Um,
cult that became really popular with Roman soldiers.
oh, sure, yeah, Mithra.
Mithra, that's right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and we talked about this in our last broadcast, if you'll remember.
yeah.
This was ultimately Plutarch makes the argument that it was a cult that was brought in by pirates, right?
Hmm.
Uh, so the Cilician pirates, right, brought in this cult, and so it comes from Asia Minor.
Yeah,
Um,
and
it may ultimately come from Tarsus, so it may have the same origin as Christianity. Interestingly enough, now there are striking similarities between the two myth bodies of Christianity and Mithra, so that they're related cults. In other words, and one is so they're drawing inspiration from one another, or Christianity is deriving some of its mythos from there's a kind of sharing of mythology because the two religions are existing at the same time.
yeah,
But
I saw it sort of as an intelligent attack upon Mars. I mean, if we see that, the attack on Ares was to kind of, alter myths about him or introduce stories that would gradually belittle him and diminish his importance slightly. That was not successful in Rome, of course. The Romans were wise to that, and so what they did is, Mars. Yeah, he's a great soldier, of course, but hey, Mithra's better, right? And it's just a way to sort of diminish fealty to Mars and divide loyalties. I think.
oh,
Sorry.
sorry, I was fumbling with my mute button there. Apologies. Yeah, I know. In fact, so it does. I mean, uh, Mithraism uh, probably plays a kind of important, underrated role in the decline of Rome. To your point, for example, we think of I think pagans like to celebrate this figure Julian the apostate. He was also in the cult of Mithra, right? Um,
And he was
so
a Neoplatonist, wasn't he?
yes, he was also a Platonist or Neoplatonist. So that's also true. Yeah, and these are not, in fact, philosophy itself in Rome was not really, it was much less of a thing really in Rome, right? Nietzsche talks about this, is that the Greeks were all about the philosophy, and they have a very rich tradition of philosophy. But I think the Romans had a more kind of cynical view of it, and probably viewed much more of it as essentially sophistry, right?
Yeah.
Plato himself and Socrates would be accused of sophistry, right? Even though Socrates would ostensibly be against the sophists. Um, he was also seen himself by some as a sophist, right? And so Romans had more that view. And you could say that, probably maybe the Greeks would view them as less, kind of more, less civilized or more barbaric, certainly less urbane because of that. But I think that they had a kind of more masculine and martial aspect generally that allowed for less philosophy, as it were, right? And another thing that Nietzsche remarks is that, which I think is a kind of a great way of looking at it, is that he um, he felt that the Greeks were sort of strong enough for philosophy, but that when a society was in decline or was kind of questioning its own existence, that was sort of the wrong time for philosophy, right? And but he felt that the Greeks were strong enough that they could sort of abide philosophy. Now, ultimately, of course, the Greeks would decline, as would the Romans, and for reasons that are not unrelated to philosophy, of course. Platonism will have a influence on Christianity as well, an important influence on Christianity. But I think that this cult of Mithra is also should kind of be given its due as one of the sort of subversive cults that led to the decline of Rome, because it was a cult that was competing with Christianity, and ultimately Christians would be, destroying the temples of Mithra and would be destroying that cult, including, killing cultists of Mithra. Um, so that they were competing cults ultimately, but I think that I think that the easiest conclusion to reach is that they had a kind of similar origin and had a similar intent, but were playing to different audiences, as it were. In the case of Mithra, it was the people who were following Mithra in the Roman Empire were a more of a kind of middle class group to some extent. They were merchants, they were soldiers, and there were also some slaves as well. Of course, there would be slaves following Christianity as well, and in Christianity had some transmission across classes as well. But Christianity has more of this aspect of pacifism, right?
Hmm.
Whereas much less is known about Mithra. So all the writings that would have been spoken, for example, in the temples, all of that has been lost, and we are left with accounts from the ancients, and also with some of the symbols that they left behind. And some of the symbols point to, I argue, a kind of shared origin with Christianity and Mithra.
Yeah.
Um, anyways, you were about to speak.
Yeah, I mean, I think they were both working towards a similar kind of goal, and maybe in competition with each other in that respect. In business, we call this seeding or beta testing, essentially. But yeah, there's different vectors of attack, and as one becomes more successful, the other one will kind of fade away, right?
Yeah, I mean, we can. I mean, I use the term caducean, right?
Yeah.
So we can see a kind of caducean conflict between those two faiths. And when I say caducean, I'm speaking of Hermes caduceus, which in Hermes caduceus is a staff entwined with two serpents that are facing each other. And the idea there is essentially it's false oppositions, right?
Yeah.
Now that doesn't mean that the people that are this would imply that the initiates, the sort of Gnostics, the people who kind of understand the myths and symbols who are promoting the cult in its origin, uh, would recognize something like this, that the myths, that the two faiths are in some ways pointed toward the same goal, which is a goal that's disruptive toward Rome, for example, that's antagonistic toward Rome and the public cults of Rome, for example. Um, so initiates would understand that, but the laity of those cults would not necessarily understand that. So they could easily view, for example, Christians as mortal enemies, for example, right? I mean, it's similar. We can look at kind of more prosaic examples in the modern world between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party.
Yeah.
Often, the sort of funding source for both parties has a kind of similar origin, that is of a, we could say, of a particular ethnic nature. So, in other words, two parties are able to be kind of controlled to the same end, um, but through different approaches.
And
Maybe,
the useful idiot on the street often doesn't recognize that, right?
yeah, yeah. No, I think that's kind of, yeah. It's almost never recognizes that, we could say, right? But um, it is a kind of testament to the resilience of Rome, that it did abide for a long time with these subversive uh, movements at work. And in Rome, there was a bias, hatred, even a kind of legal prohibition of making secret vows. Right? They didn't like the idea that people would be in temples somewhere making secret vows. Right?
Mhm.
Because what are those vows about? Right? Those vows. Why are they secret? Why do you have a secret? And this gets to kind of the distinction between mystery religions and the public state religions, right?
Mhm.
So Rome, for example, when they put down the cult of Bacchus, rather than rather than extinguish it completely, they decided it was a kind of wiser move to domesticate the cult and control the cult, to make it basically a state cult and to regulate it as a state cult. And in this way, they greatly sort of neutered the cult. The Bacchanalia, in its sort of first appearance during the Punic Wars, or shortly after, I think it was after the final Punic War, if I'm remembering correctly. It might have been after the second Punic War, but I think it was after the final Punic War. There was a real problem with these Bacchanalia in Rome, and basically what they were was, it was it was it was Antifa plus Woodstock plus the Slut March, where the Slut March where they're doing the processions, waving the dildos. They were actually doing that in the Bacchanalia, where they had a phalli. They were waving. They called it phalli instead of dildos. Um, and but it was also terrorism. So it was like Antifa to the level of where they're assassinating politicians, right, or plotting to assassinate politicians. Like, it's that level of Antifa.
Right.
And so the Romans naturally put it down, but the Bacchanalias also were like these huge sprawling gatherings where there would be thousands of people, right, in like the center of Rome. And so it was riots effectively on some level as well, and also kind of degeneracy. There was this Woodstock, orgy element as well, and the sort of licentious aspects of that cult as well. It was a heavily female cult, is one aspect of it as well, and the men that were part of the cult were described as effeminate or female in behavior. But this cult was put down, and it was reduced to a cult where only 5 people were allowed to meet to worship Bacchus, right? So they basically shut the thing completely down. I mean, it was because I think that their point, if I'm sort of to imagine from their perspective what they were attempting to do, I think they were saying basically like, okay, so you're serious about worshiping this god, which presumably you believe to be real, a real god. Okay, so we'll allow you to have an orderly worship of the god, where you can say, you can do your rituals, but you can't worship the god in this destructive anti-civilizational manner. You can go into a meeting room with only 5 people, right? And you can worship the god. And so they effectively neutered the cult, right? And
Yeah, it's interesting because I mean, the modern perception of Rome is sort of a caricature that they're just these heavy-handed, you know, soldiers and engineers that just kind of steamrolled through everything in their path, and they had no understanding of nuance and things like that. But that's actually a very intelligent, sophisticated way to deal with something degenerate and subversive. Is, legitimize it so that it loses a bit of its, its appeal, and then just something like that, limiting it to a certain amount of people. So yeah, it seems like a very intelligent way to deal with it, actually.
yeah, I mean, I think that there are cases where they were heavy-handed, um, and uh, and Nietzsche talks about this as well. Is that they do. Of course, Rome made mistakes, and one of the mistakes that Nietzsche talks about is the persecution of Christians, right? Which he thinks was a mistake because it basically it made them a cause celeb. It made them martyrs. Effectively, it gave them what they wanted, essentially, and so it increased the power of that cult. Now, I think that we can look at that question though in a critical way, from a historical perspective, and we can wonder to what extent were they persecuted. Some of it certainly is Christian exaggeration of persecution, um, but I think that I think that probably they were also persecuted. And Nietzsche points to that being a kind of mistake that the Romans made, right?
Mhm.
That was at a kind of different point during their civilization when they weren't necessarily making as intelligent decisions as they were, even during the time of the Republic, or especially during the time of the Republic. Anyways, you were about to speak.
Well, I was thinking it's just interesting, at just how strong the martial instinct is among Aryan people. I mean, even after thousands of years of Christianity, and just some of the stuff that's going on now, you still see it, right? Like, you still see volunteers in the military, first responders. They're just overwhelmingly Aryan, and that instinct is still there and is still strong, right?
Yeah, and it's related to the masculine. So the etymology of Mars is sometimes surmised to be related to a Latin word, an ancient Latin word for man, mass, I believe is it, mas, mas. So
I think I lost you. Can you hear me?
etymology of the word Mars is the circle that has this Mars's spear pointing up or the arrow pointing up from it, right? The symbol for Venus is the circle with, I believe it's a cross on it. Is that, yeah, that's the feminine symbol for
Yeah.
Venus. Um, so that understanding was also present in Rome, is that Mars represented man. And this goes back to our earlier discussion about virtue itself. Virtus is a Roman god. Virtus represents, not only is he a virtue, he's a Roman god, embodied in a Roman god, but Virtus represents virtue, but he's connected to which is the root also of virility.
Mm.
Uh, so virtue itself is connected to masculinity. In order to be virtuous in Rome, you had to be manly, you had to be masculine, right? So that was part of the ethos of Rome, as we discussed. So Mars fits in kind of perfectly with that ethos, right? And I guess the point I would emphasize, though, is because I think that there is, and this is something that the Greeks uh, criticized Ares for in their myths. They associated him with the god, rather with the animal of the vulture, because the vulture, of course, is present, after wars and in battlefields among the dead. So there's a kind of cynical view of Ares as a kind of, bloodthirsty figure in, you know, ancient Greece, and there's a need in Greece, even in descriptions of the Iliad, for example. There's a need to humiliate Ares and have like heroes sent by Athena to defeat him in battle and cause him to like run screaming from the field. I mean, this is a god of war,
Yeah.
right? It's a kind of disrespectful presentation of the god. Of course, there's a lot of subversive aspects to Iliad in general. I mean, they're literally fighting against the Aryan gods,
Yeah.
and you know what I mean. So um, there are subversive aspects to Homer. Homer, of course, cannot be criticized as an artist and as a kind of basically an unrivaled source of myth and symbol understanding, and ultimately of the Roman religion, the Greek religion itself. Um, but there are these aspects to it that are interesting, and Ares becomes more of a kind of villain, um, and a foil essentially,
Right.
where figure in even Athena, a female goddess who emerges also as a goddess of war, as a kind of counterpoint to Ares.
Mhm.
So that there's something very modern about that, right? Very modern.
Yeah,
And
very modern. And I mean, if we bring this into Apolloism and the year 2023 and into the future, um, what do you see as the role of Mars and the martial?
well, I think it's important, right? So, and I think that because really, Apollo represents many things, as we've discussed. He represents the Aryan race itself, but he especially, like another sense of the word Apollo, you could say, is that he represented nobility, right?
Right.
He represents the prince, and really the danger of nobility, because every civilization needs leadership, and we're lacking that now. We're lacking a kind of aristocracy or nobility that has vision, that's willing to guide the civilization in a healthy and salubrious direction. That's something that we're lacking, and that's why I'm focused on the figure of Apollo, because I think that that's where we are. We need to kind of start with the brain first, and then grow the body from the brain. Mars or Ares, we might understand more as kind of representing the body, as it were, but Ares, the the danger with Apollo, and you even see this in the myths. And again, we can understand uh, these some of these myths, which we can understand as kind of profane in a way,
Mhm.
or subversive, is showing homosexuality with Apollo, for example. Um, that they either have a kind of Cretan or Theban or proto-Jewish origin, or they're just kind of developed unwisely, right? Because we can't really know exactly the answer of the origin or the reason that these myths were developed, but they are not myths. They are myths that we wouldn't discard, in the sense that we would study them and be aware of them, but we would understand them ultimately as kind of subversive, because there's a lot of kind of symbol information and knowledge there that we want to hold on to. I'm in favor of keeping the New Testament, the Hebrew Bible, all of that stuff. I think is extremely valuable. The Iliad, of course, and all the Greek and Roman myths and the Norse myths and all of it, the Celtic myth. It's all very valuable and beautiful and wonderful and interesting, and artists and religion makers need it as a kind of reference to corroborate symbol meaning and symbol understanding. But there is this aspect of Apollo where, in a problem with the elites too, generally, uh, that's symbolized in these subversive myths, that the elites can become kind of effeminate, as it were, right, or effete, or indifferent, or ineffectual, um, uh, not I guess effeminate is the best word, right? So that's a danger of the elite. That's a danger of privilege, of power, of luxury, of being out of harm's way for a certain period of time. So I think that they kind of require probably a sort of organized replenishment from other classes, where ambition is still present and virility is still present. And that's probably something that's a kind of requirement. And also, they just require a a martial mentality or martial thinking, martial training in their education among the elite. But Mars is an important figure because uh, Mars represents that, right? So he represents that uber masculine element, whether it's an element of Apollo himself or we understand him as a distinct god and a distinct class. And of course, the danger of the everyman Aryan class or Mars class is one more of slovenliness, sloth, laziness, um, a disintegration of civility and decorum, a disintegration of seriousness.
And probably I would say the biggest potential weaknesses of all is just outsourcing your obligations.
Yes. Yeah. So there has to be a fealty between the classes as well. I think it's a point that you're
Yeah.
making. Yeah. So there has to be a fealty between the Apollonian and martial or Martian class. And that's a part of Apolloism, right? So that's as an Orthodox Apollonian, that's I swear fealty to the martial class. That would be part of the Apollonian position. The Orthodox Apollonian position would be strong fealty to the martial or Martian class.
Yeah.
Um,
In my own mind, I sometimes struggle with the order. Like, you wonder, does the martial need to rise up first and sort of clear the deck for the Apollonian to flourish? Does a Jupiterian figure need to, pave the way for both of them? Like, should there be an order to which characteristics and which god have a period of primacy?
um, I don't know. I mean, I think that the figure. I mean, I think you're right. What you're getting at is correct in the sense that Jupiter represents a usurpation of Saturn and all that Saturn represents. Um, and so he also becomes a figure that we have to venerate as well because of that, right?
Mhm.
Um, but Apollo is understood as more of a futurist god, or he represents the sun in the future. So, and he's a eugenic god, and he represents a kind of improvement and a development. So,
An aspirational god for sure.
yeah, yeah, but something like, I mean, to your point, something like Apollo can only really occur in earnest once there is a usurpation. I think is what you might be getting at.
Yeah.
But what I would say though is that usurpation can come in many ways, right? So I don't think it's for example, it could come in a political way, and I think that those it will come in a political way, but it also can come simultaneously in a cultural way, and these things can develop simultaneously as they would anyways, as they naturally do. Um, and I think it needs both. But when we're thinking about the cultural aspect, I think Apollo, the deity of Apollo, is very important to that cultural aspect, because he is the god of artists, a god of music, um, and so I think both can happen simultaneously. And I think that Apollo, in his ideal form, is has that Mars aspect. So he's a kind of complete man. So he's martial, masculine. We can think of the English aristocracy as a kind of example.
Or the all-American
Yeah, yeah,
student.
the or the American, America also, neither America nor England produced a kind of perfect Apollonian type, of course, but to the extent that he represents nobility, though, I think that we can look at the English aristocracy as approximating imperfectly a kind of Apollonian type in the sense that they were martial and they were interested in hunting, but they were also cultivated and civilized and literate and intelligent. So again, I mean, there are kind of imperfect manifestation of it, Christianity, I think, was a big problem there, of course.
Yeah.
It didn't allow the full flowering of an Apollonian type. But I think that we can see kind of fragments of an Apollonian development there, certainly. Now, to your point, the All American on some level too. I mean, America is a kind of younger child, of course, than England, and in a way, it developed. Even though Christianity is more of a thing in America, I think it also was it had a sort of freer development in some ways as well, including along sort of secular lines. I would argue, um, but in any case, I think that this sort of athletic spirit in America is definitely a kind of Greco-Roman manifestation, and that became very powerful and salient in America. Probably more so than in Europe. Ultimately, it has kind of negative manifestations with the professional sports and stuff like that. But it's not, this is all a matter of kind of details and managing it and figuring out a more positive manifestations of it. But sports itself is definitely a kind of positive and eugenic development. It was developed to train warriors in Greece, right?
Mhm.
So the gymnasium was the reason they developed the gymnasium is so they could kill other people who were wanted to kill them, other tribes or other groups of people.
Mhm.
That's the reason the gymnasium developed, and that's why they practiced athletics was to fight. So it had a very practical application, but it also had a very kind of sacred application as well. And this is one of the reasons that sports are sacred, right?
Well,
Um,
and I think it's very important for Aryans, maybe everybody really, but Aryans specifically, of course, to not lose touch with any of those gods. Um, to maintain, some connection with Mars, Jupiter, and Apollo. I think you stay a complete man that way.
yeah, yeah, no, in like again, I think that Rome tried to develop the cult of Apollo late during the period of emperors. Augustus was a big, I mean, Apollo was a god known to the Romans, you know, through the Republic and um, through the life of Rome ultimately, but in an important god as well. But he really became emphasized by Augustus.
Mhm.
Um, but it was it was a kind of
And
you
maybe
know
that was a point where they recognize that they need some rejuvenation, right?
Yeah, yep. So he became a god of rejuvenation, of Renaissance, essentially. And
Yeah.
the figure of the Renaissance man actually has similarities to Apollo, who Apollo represents a kind of polymath.
And,
Uh,
and, and ironically, they were rejuvenated by Germans. I mean, if the Roman Empire had it continued on, it would have been largely Germanic, I would think, right?
yeah, yeah, and it probably in its origin it was kind of more Germanic, or what we would say is Germanic, right? That
Yeah.
was kind of the understanding in the among classicists and people who studied Rome in the up to the early 1900s. That was the view of Rome,
Yeah.
right? Before World War II, that was the view of Rome, is that it was kind of more of a Germanic phenomena, at least racially, right?
Mhm.
And they point to the language, the Rome Latin, you know what I mean, which is a very kind of when you speak Latin, it's a very I guess it has similarities to German, and it's not the most.
Well, I think genetic studies have backed that up as well.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. And
yeah.
interestingly, there was actually a new temple to Mars that was built just this March on the Appian Way in Rome.
Oh, excellent. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So there will be a pagan revival. There's no question about it. But the key is that it is the kind of nature of its development. I'm optimistic, though. I bet there's a lot of people that are kind of developing it for the right reasons. If I had to guess, you know what I mean. And I'm sure there's some people that are not, but uh, I think the Apollonian project will be useful to the development of this religion. I'm sure of it. So, and I look forward to meeting with some of these people in the world, and seeing if we're kindred spirits or we're not. You know what I mean? But I think it will be a good. It will be. It will be ultimately a kind of good development.
Yeah, I think even the interaction alone will, create an energy itself, right?
Yeah, I think that I think that I think that they will. I think that they will like what we're doing ultimately, or some will not like what we're doing, of course, and um, but they don't really matter. The people that do like what we're doing matter, right?
Yes.
And so I think that we'll find kindred spirits, and that will be a good development. And I think that the faith will regrow, and it will find itself, right? And through the people that bring it into being, it will find itself. And yeah, I'm just excited that I get to be a part of it ultimately.
Yeah.
Um, but it's I don't know. It's religion is a theory, and I think this is true of Judaism as well. In fact, the word Torah has multiple definitions. One of them is science, interestingly enough. One is theory, and it is because it reveals that religion is a theory, that you practice a theory, and and Jews have shown that the theory of Judaism is a valid, successful theory. They've proven that the theory works. The Romans showed that the theory of their religion worked as well, evidently, right?
Yeah.
So much of their civilization owes its success ultimately to the Greco-Roman religion. I mean, I think that kind of goes without saying. So that's interesting. Where it'll be good to get back to that place where we're kind of calling the shots as far as the development of a religion is concerned.
Yeah. And in the meantime, I mean, most of you out there who are Apollonian, you should pay homage to Mars. I think that's, it's the god that represents a lot of us, right?
Yeah, and he said, and the Romans were right to ennoble him, um, because I mean, he was the backbone of that civilization, and ultimately Mars is the backbone of every Aryan civilization.
Yeah.
And so he should be venerated. And Rome was also wise to venerate. They also sort of rehabilitated Venus as well, and they had like pious or virgin forms of Venus, Venus Urana, Venus of the heavens, that would become these forms of Venus would be imitated in the cult of Christianity, with the figure of Mary, for example. But of course, importantly, in Rome, they would pair her with Mars, so it was a kind of Aryan, a beautiful Aryan every woman, who represented, femininity in a kind of very like distinct form, and then you had this
That's
very
that.
masculine male figure. So the contrast between the genders is very strong between that in that pairing. Anyways, please.
Yeah. That's what I took the Cupid to essentially represent, that from a eugenic pairing, love develops, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think yeah, and I don't think that, again, I think that the figure of Cupid is a more complex figure in Greece, and I think he has more subversive meaning in Greece. But I think I take that idea in Rome as basically kind of more innocent um, development or manifestation, where essentially they were saying that, right? That love or eros is between Cupid is between Mars and Venus.
Hmm.
Um, so I think so. I think there was a kind of more innocent, simpler formation there. Um, uh, in Greece, so Eros is descended of night and all these chthonic gods, and I think he has more of a kind of a diabolical manifestation in some ways. But I think that maybe the Romans had the right idea in sort of rehabilitating Cupid in that way as well. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Creating that a notion of romantic chemistry between, to the extent that it represents that, I think it does. Um, between Mars and Venus.
Yeah.
Dimorphism is the word I was looking for. Dimorphism. There's strong dimorphism between Mars and Venus, right?
And dimorphism, if anybody doesn't know what that means, it just means a much stronger gender identity, separation between them.
Differentiation. Yeah, it's so. And I think that, again, I think that that's one of the reasons it's and I think another good pairing too, which might represent kind of more of a noble pairing, is Diana and Apollo. Now they are actually brother and sister, right? But of course, Jupiter and Juno are brother and sister, right? So, in what we're talking about when we're talking about gods, we're talking about archetypes that they themselves represent races or tribes, you could say, right?
Yeah.
Just like Judah represents a tribe, like Japheth represents a tribe, like Jacob represents a tribe. You could say the same of Apollo. He represents an Aryan tribe, and especially nobility, right?
Right.
He represents that founding group. That's really what he represents. To your earlier point, he represents that founding group. That and the founding group, of course, becomes the aristocracy or the nobility, right? Because they're the first ones to kind of lay claim, and from the descendants become more, vassal, I guess, on some level, or not of the same status, in especially people that are coming in afterwards. So he represents that founding group.
Yeah. Yeah. And Diana's an interesting god. I mean, that we could go off on a tangent on that, but I mean, she's, the goddess of the hunt. I mean, that's a very unique female representation.
Yeah, I mean, we maybe to some extent we can tackle some of the more interesting gods in this series, right? And just devote like an hour to each god or something like that. That might be a useful way of thinking about this series. Some probably have more to be said about them than others, but they're all pretty interesting, especially the 12 Olympians, right? They're not part of the 12 without being interesting.
Right.
Um, and also, and things that we should be aware of too. They become useful models of thought and ways of thinking about the world. I mean, in a way, they become these sort of Platonic ideals. And I think that they become useful for the artist. They become useful for, as well. They become role models, right? For the so we talked about this on another on another broadcast, that Virtus, or some of these gods that represented these ancient Roman virtues. We could see easily that, like, a child would be introduced to one of the idols in a temple by his father and be like, this is the myth of the guy. He stood on this bridge and he slew 15 guys, and like he went back for all his guys, or whatever whatever myth, because I think a lot of those myths around Virtus have disappeared. But you could see a father explaining that to his son, or a priest explaining it to the father's son, or something like this.
Mm-hmm.
But then Virtus becomes a model in the child's mind, right?
Yeah.
And he emulates the model. So he directs his behavior and conduct toward that model. And also, it influences breeding decisions in the population as well. So women become aware of that model as this venerated and powerful model in the society, and they seek men that are similar to Virtus or to Mars or to Apollo, or whatever the case may be, right?
Yeah, these are the things we need more than anything else, right? Is just people to, discover those characteristics in themselves and cultivate them.
Yeah. So it becomes they become good models of cultivation in one's own mind, in one's own life, the individual. But they also, as a societal phenomena, they serve to cultivate the entire society by giving it a direction, giving it a model, an ideal to direct breeding to, ultimately breeding and conduct and ethos, right? So yeah, I mean, it's all good stuff. I mean, what do you think? We've gone an hour. It should
Yeah, I guess we should probably wind it down now.
we can do another god too, if people like that. Leave a comment if you think that we should do gods.
You know what? Maybe we can do a vote on Twitter.
Oh yeah,
That would be a good one.
We can use that technology.
That's right. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Let me try to, I'm going to try and um, get us out of here with a little movie.
Okay. Then I will sign off by muting myself.
All right. Great. We'll talk soon.
It was not part of their blood. It came to them very late, with long arrears to make good, when the Saxon began to hate. They were not easily moved. They were icy, willing to wait till every count should be proved, ere the Saxon began to hate. Their voices were even and low, their eyes were level and straight. There was neither sign nor show when the Saxon began to hate. It was not preached to the crowd, it was not taught by the state. No man spoke it aloud when the Saxon began to hate. Who is historical is quite rare. He is both intelligent and brave. For himself he has little care. Yet he is neither rogue nor slave. Citing from those whence he's grown, with his thoughts he repeats no man. Indeed, his ideas, they are his own. In the name of truth, he does all that he can. He avoids trappings of historical man, who is in some fey cargo cult involved. He commits himself to clever work or plan, so the problems of his age are solved. So lift high those whose work is great. Be unjealous of things you did not say. Remove from your heart envious hate. At the very least, get out of the way. Serve well those who serve you. Remain to friend and forebearer true, to Apollo's highest virtues hew, and give credit where credit is due. For Mercury does not on Olympus live, rather in deepest Tartarus he grieves. Olympus is a place for those who give, but it is not a place for he who thieves. His place is in the east and the south. If you betray, if you thieve, and if you lie, strike the name Apollo from your mouth, for you will see jealous Pluto when you die. Indeed, do not the God of truth defame, by your actions muddying his name, lest the God of truth receive the blame, thereby bringing to all your people shame. Aye, the time for dishonor, it has passed. By Vulcan's fire, the world itself burns. And yet we are a people born to last. We are immortal Apollo, and Apollo returns.